Today we're diving into one of the most urgent questions of our time. What happens when politics stops being about politics and instead becomes about people? When disagreement curdles into hatred, contempt, and even dehumanization. Sociologists call it affective polarisation.
And it basically means that if I disagree with you about an issue, I don't just simply disagree with your ideas, which is what it's traditionally been. I also think that you are a bad person, or I regard you as morally inferior to me. But suddenly, a lot of people in Birmingham have said, look, if we can't even celebrate our own national flag, but we can celebrate all these other flags, something is fundamentally wrong. And the flagging movement began in response to that and just spread very, very swiftly.
I am John O'Brien, Head of Communications at MCC Brussels, and welcome to today's conversation and our podcast series, Deep Dives. Frank Furedi, Head of MCC Brussels and author of the Roots and Wings Substack, has been tracking how this trend is tearing at the fabric of civil life, from the small towns in England to the political battlegrounds of America. In his recent essay, Frank reflects on the shocking reactions to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Not only the killing itself, but the way some voices in the media and on social platforms mocked, justified, or even celebrated his death. Across the Atlantic in a small town, Faversham in Kent, Frank has also witnessed how ordinary expressions of national identity, like flying the flag of St. George, have been recast as signals of extremism, sparking clashes between working-class flaggers and their middle-class opponents. In both cases, what's at stake is more than politics. It's whether we can still recognise our opponents as fellow citizens. Frank, thanks for joining us. In your article, you describe affective polarisation, this gulf or chasm that's developing between people, as something distinct from the traditional right and left ideological conflict. At its core, is it more about psychology and identity than about politics? And if so, does that make it harder to reverse?
Well, affective polarization is very interesting because it's a kind of polarization that isn't just simply focused on your views, your sentiments, your ideological position. What has happened is that differences between people have acquired this very important psycho-emotional dimension to it. And it basically means that if I disagree with you about an issue, I don't just simply disagree with your ideas, which is what it's traditionally been. I also think that you are a bad person, or I regard you as morally inferior to me. So affective polarization focuses on the fact that it basically sees the other side in a way that kind of moralizes their existence, sometimes dehumanizes them, because you don't see them as people like you. You see them as people like them, and that has very important implications. Now, you touched on identity. That's very important, because what we now have is a situation where political differences interweave with different identities. And the politicization of identity lends differences an altogether different character. It basically creates these silos that we're very familiar with. It means very often that you and I aren't just simply political opponents, but we eat in different restaurants, we drive different cars, we listen to different kind of music, we wear different kind of clothes, and all together there's a kind of hostility that's really been kind of created, which basically means that when you see somebody on the other side of the political divide, you don't see an opponent, you see an enemy.
You argue that hostility towards opponents now amounts to a kind of prejudice. What makes you confident that this isn't just rhetoric, that it is truly a form of dehumanization comparable to older forms of bigotry?
Well, it's a kind of bigotry, but in one sense, it isn't like bigotry used to be. I think it's very difficult to get your head around the fact that some very important changes have kicked in. So if you, for example, watch the people that celebrated Charlie Kirk's murder, and you listen carefully, and you watch their facial expression and the words they use, it's very, very clear that in the first instance, they behave almost like naughty children that haven't learned how to restrain themselves. The kind of reactions they have reminds me of a 6-year-old child taking tremendous delight of the fact that one of their friends has stumbled and has hurt their knee. They kind of laugh, and they haven't yet learned to empathize. Mm-hmm. So the absence of empathy in this way, in this childish kind of way, speaks to a kind of infantilization, this kind of lack of maturity, certainly lack of moral maturity, which basically is very important. And then the second thing that is very much related to this is the way that identity works, because the politicization of identity has a very interesting impact upon how you view any kind of discussion, any kind of differences. If I'm a trans person and you question trans ideology, then the way that I regard it is that you're not just simply questioning my ideology, you're questioning my very existence. Right, and when you feel that your existence has been put to question, then it's understandable that you react in this kind of very violent, hostile kind of a way, which is different than in the past. I mean, I know from personal experience that when I was young, I could have friends on the left and on the right of the political divide. The three of us could go out for a drink together, have a couple of beers, laugh and joke, even though we had big disputes about politics. But nevertheless, we regarded each other as human beings with very similar kind of aspirations and ideals. That's gone. Mm. It's unthinkable that some of these people who are laughing at Charlie Kirk would go out for a drink with a Republican.
You write about the chilling response to Charlie Kirk's assassination, where some celebrated his death. To what extent do you see this as a turning point, a Utah moment for Western societies?
I don't think it's a turning point. I think it's been a long time coming. For example, the tendency to dehumanize your opponents and therefore not to empathize with the misfortune that befalls upon them, not to even see that there's something weird, it's eerie and wrong about their death. That's happened before. I think happened on a very big scale on October the 7th, when a lot of people regarded the outrageous pogroms committed by Hamas as somehow acceptable. And they basically, even the feminists, suddenly had decided that, okay, maybe some Jewish women in southern Israel were raped and violated and killed, but their reaction was very, very different to the kind of reaction they had about their own experience, because these women would basically kind of create a lot of hassle if somebody wolf whistled another woman. That was like seen as beyond the pale outrageous. Yet these same women, when they see a Jewish woman being murdered, killed, or raped, do not react. That tells us that something deeply disturbing has happened. And I think that tendency to not to see the other person as a human being has become very, very strong. And I think that's something that we're now becoming much more aware of, and the consequences of that obviously are clearly crystallized in reaction to Charlie Kirk's murder.
Now, some people might argue that Charlie Kirk himself was polarizing, and therefore it's unsurprising that emotions ran high. How do you respond to that idea that someone who people regard as controversial almost invite their own this kind of reaction, people saying things like this?
Well, I think the logic of that is that if you disagree with the kind of conformist majority, if you call into question the prevailing norms of a particular institution, then somehow you take your life in your hands. That somehow there is something very risky about opening your mouth. And if that's the logic, that somehow challenging the prevailing norms and the status quo means that you had it coming, that in some shape or form you've asked for it, which is basically what's really being said there, is something that would not really be accepted in other circumstances. So, for example, if you have a situation where a young woman goes out with very short a skirt and very provocative form of dress, and she gets into trouble, then for people to say that she's asked for it would be a cause for outrage. People would say, well, how could you say that? Well, in this, that's all right in that case. But in this particular case, if you support certain norms that are countercultural at the moment, then in a sense you've asked for it. And I think that basically tells us the lack of appetite for difference.
Yeah, and that we're in trouble. In Faversham, a very small, beautiful English village in Kent, you describe the flagging, this campaign to raise the St. George flag, but also even lifestyle choices in that community as markers of people's political tribes, flying the Palestinian flag, flying the EU flag. Do you think these visible signals are drivers of division, or are they merely symptoms of the fractures that are there?
They're symptoms of the fractures that are there, but at the same time, by giving those fractures a tangible quality, by making them very visual, what you're doing is you're, in a sense, enhancing those fractures and deepening them. And one of the things that I find very interesting is that suddenly symbols that had no meaning beforehand acquires this incredible importance in terms of identity. So, for example, we saw that after Brexit, when you had a division between people that wanted to leave the EU and those that didn't, suddenly the ones that didn't want to leave the EU started waving the EU flag. Nobody had done that beforehand. Mm-hmm. I mean, the only place you found EU flags was in interstate conferences on tables, but nobody, took that flag seriously. Suddenly, you had all these people waving the EU flags, and that has happened almost overnight. So what happens, I think, is that when you have a kind of these kind of politicized identities based on lifestyle, then very, very, very swiftly, new symbols can emerge, or certain things that were existed beforehand can be embraced as a new symbol. So why is it that suddenly the Palestinian flag and the Palestinian scarf has acquired this universal quality of moral rectitude? Mm-hmm. Why do all these people feel the need? If you have a big Hollywood sort of event, people feel the need to put their Palestinian scarf on to demonstrate their virtue.
Did you see the St. George, hanging the St. George flag, did you see that as a necessary pushback against some of the other symbolization that has been overwhelming in British society in recent days?
I think so. I think you have to remember that the whole thing began, the origins of the flagging began in Birmingham, where a young, I believe like a 13-year-old girl went to school on National Day when different nationalities wore their national dresses, dressed in a Union Jack, the flag of Britain. She was told to go home, that was not acceptable. And that that was like quite an interesting moment, because suddenly a lot of people in Birmingham said, look, if we can't even celebrate our own national flag, but we can celebrate all these other flags, something is fundamentally wrong. And the flagging movement began in response to that and just spread very, very swiftly. It spread very, very swiftly because people were already predisposed to react, and they needed something to find their voice, and they needed something that acted as a catalyst to bring out the sentiments and the feelings that they already had. And I think the flagging movement, to that extent, is a very important grassroots movement that, in a sense, in every single sense, spontaneous, self-organized, and has a tremendous potential of creating, of making a big impact in English society. A lot depends on many things, but at the moment, it's one of the most interesting and original developments that occurred in post-war British society.
Now, you highlight the role of class in your article, noting that flaggers were largely working class, while the counter-demonstrators to the flags were middle class and educated. How much of effective polarization today is really a class war in disguise?
I think that the class tension is palpable. It's very, very strong. There's a very clear division between the two sides. In my town, in Faversham, there are two Favershams where people speak very different. And I first noticed that at the time of Brexit, where the day after Brexit, I went into a butcher shop, and everybody was talking about, isn't it wonderful that we managed to get out of the EU? And I smiled at them And they looked at me and they said, "Are you for Brexit?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Oh, we didn't think people like you, me being a university professor, would be for Brexit." An hour later, I go into the university, I go into the senior common room where all the professors are, and it's like a clinic. Everybody's crying and everybody's feeling really, really bad because everybody in that environment hated Brexit. And you could really see very, very clearly that there were two different Englands existing side by side. And since that event, since leaving EU, that division has really, really deepened. It's become much stronger. A couple of days after the first flagging incident, I was walking on this road and there were some flaggers trying to put up a flag, and this couple of guys walked by, kind of criticized, yelling at them. And one of these anti-flaggers said to them, "Why don't you educate yourself?" The implication being that you were stupid, you were intellectually inferior to us, the educated. And it occurred to me that not only was this extremely patronizing, but also it indicated to me that they weren't taking education seriously, even though they were meant to be educated. Because in the 19th century, when you had a really educated middle class, they saw their role as one of helping the working people to educate themselves. And they set up all these institutions. They didn't say, why don't you educate yourself? What they did was they basically went out, they devoted resources towards taking seriously their fellow citizens and helping them to get education. Whereas in this instance, when you say, why don't you educate yourself, that's just a swear word, saying that you're just an idiot.
Yeah. You cite politicians liking opponents to Nazis or fascists. How much responsibility do the elites bear for inflaming effective polarization compared to grassroots movements and social media dynamics?
Well, I think one of the things that has occurred for many decades now is that our political elites are trying to limit political discussions, and they do it many, many ways. They do it by quarantining ideas they don't like. They do it by outsourcing political decisions to experts and to courts. But also what they're trying to do is to basically put a warning sign against certain ideas. And one of the ways that they put a warning sign against a particular point of view or particular individuals is by using the "just like Hitler" rhetoric. I mean, when you look at the expansion of "just like Hitler," the number of times you hear that, when you hear people being compared to the Nazis, when you hear this talk that it's just like the 1930s, you have this very, very, very Philistine, very, very kind of ignorant sort of attempt to basically condemn ideas that with which you disagree, and the Nazis label, fascist label, which you so promiscuously attach to other people, is very, very dangerous. I mean, it's obviously very dangerous because, if it was the case that a march of 1.5 million people in London consists of fascists and Nazis, as has been suggested, it's a racist march, then I could understand why many, many people would be thinking of moving to another nation, another society.
Do you think traditional institutions, universities, churches, the media, still have the capacity to act as mediators, or have they too become partisan players?
I think that if you look at the role of these institutions, principally cultural institutions, they have become quite complicit in taking the side of one section of society. When you listen to even some of the members of the judiciary who are meant to be impartial and neutral, and they make certain statements, it becomes very, very clear that they support a particular side and that they have no sympathy, or not even sympathy, not even empathy, not even the modicum of minimal understanding of why some citizens are kicking back and why they're flying flags or why they have the views that they do. So I've drawn the conclusion that at the moment, these institutions are incapable of playing the kind of traditional national role for a very simple reason, that they don't see themselves as genuine national institutions. They have no sense of nationhood and no sense of patriotism. They don't really accept the fact that there's something common within the foundations of our society. They don't make any effort to create a sense of belonging to which everybody could belong, because they're much more interested in multiculturalism, in encouraging polarization, albeit sort of not in an extreme way, than they are in bringing people together. So I think to that extent, unfortunately, these institutions are a problem rather than a solution. And until, in a sense, new institutions are created, not much will happen. I mean, a very good example of what needs to be done is with the media, because the legacy media has played a very important role in shutting down discussion. Mm-hmm. Very, very, very important role. And it wasn't until the social media began to emerge where people had a greater direct access to all kinds of different opinions, and where they themselves could find their voice. And it wasn't until that occurred that these opposition movements could come into being. And the flagging movement is a very good example, mm-hmm. because it's very clearly not just a grassroots movement, but a social media-led grassroots movement.
Some conservatives have now begun to say, in light of Charlie Kirk's murder, that the time for dialogue is over. What would it mean if one side of the political divide effectively gave up on dialogue altogether?
Well, it would mean that all sides would give up on dialogue, right? Because the people that killed Charlie Kirk and the people that celebrated that don't believe in dialogue anyway, don't believe in serious debate and discussion. And that's a problem. Now, if the other side also follows suit and says there's no point in debating, there's no point in discussing with these people, look at them, they're all celebrating the murder of one of our own, look at them, look how they're behaving, they're not going to listen to us. If the other side does that as well, then basically what we're saying is that democratic dialogue of any sort is impossible. And I think that it is important to realize that as difficult as a dialogue is, and as difficult as it is to ensure that the culture of debate remains intact in our society, it's necessary if democracy is going to survive. But it's also necessary because at the moment, people like Charlie Kirk had the moral authority, occupied the moral high ground because of their attitude towards discussion and debate. As long as we're kind of supporting free speech and upholding the right to free expression, as long as we're doing that, we occupy the moral high ground. Once we give up on that, then we end up with the rest with our opponents and end up occupying the moral low ground. So that would be a disaster. That would be a very childish reaction to the murder of Charlie Kirk.
American Vice President J.D. Vance has gone further, suggesting that people who laugh at Kirk's death should be reported in their workplaces. Some employers have responded by firing people. Does that response risk intensifying the same logic of dehumanization you've been warning about, or is it an inevitable defensive reaction?
I can really understand why, if I was running a shop or running a business, and I found that one of my employees believed that the killing of Charlie Kirk was very funny, I really wouldn't want to work with a person like that. And I think that under those circumstances, those employers have every right to kind of fire somebody. However, at the same time, I do believe that people's right to express themselves freely is inviolable.
Even if they're stupid.
Even if they're stupid.
Wrong.
It may have consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, free speech is not risk-free. Mm-hmm. Having the capacity to say what you want, you may well pay a price for that. At the very least, you court unpopularity, or you could court unpopularity. It may well be the case that you get ostracized. It may well be the case that some employers, some other individuals will not want you to work for them. As long as these institutions are private institutions, I think it's entirely legitimate for them to reject people who behave in such barbaric kind of a way. But I know it's difficult. It is really difficult to tolerate that kind of behavior, the kind of behavior we saw in response to the murder of Charlie Kirk. But we need to be grown up enough to say that at the end of the day, free speech, the freedom of communication and expression, is far more important than the sickness, the emotional sickness that we feel against those individuals.
In the fight back against effective polarization, what is the most important thing that you think citizens should be doing?
I think citizens should be building their communities, because the stronger the communities within which you live, the more free you feel, the more you feel that you really count for something, the greater the solidarity between people. And solidarity can break down the more insidious dimensions of the divisions that we now have. I think that if you can build communities, then that would be the first step towards the next one, which is to basically call into question the whole philosophy and the whole institutionalization of multiculturalism. Because what multiculturalism does is it allows these divisions, many of our divisions, to flourish and to thrive. And basically, we have to insist that in a nation, in a society, we all have to sign up to the same cultural values. We all have to feel that we belong to the same team. If you don't have that, then polarization, effective polarization, will go from bad to worse.
Frank, thanks for joining us. We're going to put the link to your Substack in the notes for this program so that the viewers can have a read and tell us what they think. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That was Frank Furedi, head of MCC Brussels and author of the Substack Roots and Wings, helping us see how the murder of Charlie Kirk and the flag wars in towns like Faversham are symptoms of the same underlying crisis. Effective polarisation isn't just about the left versus the right. It's about treating those who live, vote and believe differently as moral inferiors, enemies rather than neighbours. It's about losing the ability to argue without hating and to disagree without dehumanising. If you want to explore more of Frank's work, check out his Substack, Roots and Wings. And if you found value in this conversation, share it, rate it, and subscribe so we can keep having these difficult but necessary discussions. Until next time, stay curious, stay civil, and remember, democracy depends on how we treat those we most disagree with. This is John O'Brien, signing off for MCC Brussels.